Welcome everyone. Today we're stepping right into the ashes of 1945 to explore a living, breathing, and frankly terrifying era, the Cold War. For 44 years, humanity was trapped in this massive global chess match where our very survival literally hung by a thread. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some political disagreement. It was a massive collision of immense egos, profound paranoia, and unprecedented technological power that completely rewired human civilization.
So, it really begins with this profound historical mystery. How on earth did the Grand Alliance, the very saviors who bled together to crush Nazi Germany, turn their guns on each other almost overnight? How did this incredible triumph of global cooperation instantly fracture into a standoff that dragged us all right to the edge of nuclear annihilation?
Section 1. The Shattered Grand Alliance. To really grasp this ideological chasm, you have to mentally step right into the ruins of Europe. Joseph Stalin was staring at a completely devastated nation. The Soviet Union had lost at least 25 million people, and a third of their wealth was just reduced to ash. He was absolutely desperate for a physical, territorial buffer. On the flip side, you have Harry Truman looking at that exact same rubble and fearing that punishing Germany would just breed another radicalized monster, exactly like the Treaty of Versailles had done decades earlier. Their definitions of security were totally mutually exclusive. A clash was basically inevitable.
And the sheer speed of this collapse was just dizzying. Back in February 1945 at Yalta, a dying FDR was making concessions just to keep the peace. But by July, at the Potsdam Conference, the atmosphere was completely poisonous. Truman, who was newly sworn in, tries to casually drop this terrifying trump card, the successful test of the Trinity atomic bomb. He's hoping to intimidate Moscow, right? But Stalin's face doesn't even twitch. Thanks to his sprawling network of spies, he already knew all about it. The absolute chilling tension in that room irrevocably altered the geopolitical landscape.
Here's the harsh truth. This alliance was built entirely on shared survival. It was never built on trust. The Soviets harbored this deep, simmering resentment over how long the Western Allies took to open a second front in France. They really felt the Red Army was left to bleed out the Nazi war machine all alone. The West, meanwhile, never forgot Stalin's cynical 1939 non-aggression pact with Hitler. So the very second their mutual enemy fell, the masks came right off.
Section 2. Containment and the Iron Curtain.
So, in response, the U.S. completely revolutionizes its worldview, heavily influenced by diplomat George Kennan's urgent long telegram from Moscow. The new strategy became containment. Washington realized you couldn't simply negotiate a stable peace with Stalin. Soviet expansionism had to be walled off, both militarily and economically. It framed the next half-century not as a political rivalry, but as a zero-sum existential war between free societies and totalitarian darkness.
And $13 billion. That is the staggering economic force the U.S. deployed first. Fearing that post-war starvation and poverty would drive Western Europe straight into the arms of communism, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan. They flooded Europe with $13 billion to rebuild democratic systems. But Stalin didn't look at this and see charity. Oh no, he saw an insidious American plot to just buy the loyalty of the continent. In response, he forcefully barred his Eastern Bloc satellite states from accepting a single dime.
This economic divide quickly hardened into heavily armed military blocs. In 1949, the West formed NATO, which was a mutual defense shield. And by 1955, the Soviets answered with the Warsaw Pact, effectively locking down Soviet hegemony over Eastern Europe. The world was now literally severed in two. Lines were drawn on maps, massive standing armies stared at each other across borders, and both sides dug in, anticipating an apocalyptic clash.
Section 3. A City Divided.
To really understand the human cost here, we need to look at Berlin. Between 1945 and 1961, up to 4 million East Germans essentially voted with their feet. They fled to the porous borders of Berlin to the west. Now, this wasn't just an embarrassment for the Soviets. It was an existential hemorrhage. East Germany was losing its brightest minds, its doctors, its youth. Without a workforce, the Soviet-backed state was teetering on the verge of total collapse.
Just imagine the sheer panic of waking up on Sunday morning, August 13, 1961. Under the cover of darkness, in this brutally swift military operation, East German forces rolled out miles of barbed wire. They severed streets, train lines, and tore families apart overnight. That wire quickly calcified into concrete walls, guard towers, and minefields. The Berlin Wall became the ultimate, devastating physical manifestation of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain, turning half a city into a literal prison for the next 28 years.
And right there at that wall, humanity almost ended.
In October 1961 at Checkpoint Charlie, American and Soviet tanks rolled up just 100 yards apart, engines idling, cannons loaded and aimed point blank. Top leaders in Washington and Moscow watched in absolute horror, realizing that the fate of the entire world was resting in the hands of nervous 20-year-old tank commanders on the ground. Crazy, right? It was only through desperate, back-channel diplomacy that they were able to slowly, agonizingly reverse their engines.
Section 4. The surrogate battlefield.
Because direct conflict meant global suicide, the battlefield had to shift. When Sputnik launched in 1957, it wasn't just some cool scientific breakthrough. It triggered absolute hysteria in the West. As that tiny metal sphere transmitted its innocent little radio beep across American skies, the Pentagon realized a terrifying truth. If the Soviets possessed rockets powerful enough to put a satellite in orbit, they had the technology to drop a nuclear warhead on Washington, D.C. in under 30 minutes. Space had been weaponized.
What followed was this totally unprecedented head-to-head technological duel. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became a Soviet god by completing the first orbital flight. Just months later, the Americans answered by putting John Glenn into orbit. This wasn't just about exploring the cosmos anymore. Space had become the ultimate proxy for ideological supremacy. Every single rocket launch was basically a massive argument over which system, capitalism or communism, owned the future.
The climax of this whole celestial battle arrives in July 1969. By landing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the lunar surface, the United States executed a flex of industrial and technological might so overwhelming that the Soviets just could not match it. It was a spectacular human achievement for sure, but strategically, it allowed the West to claim definitive victory in this specific theater of the ideological war.
Section 5. The brink of annihilation.
Okay, you really have to grasp the profoundly twisted logic that kept the peace during this era. There was no goodwill. There was no shared humanity. Stability relied entirely on mad, mutually assured destruction. It was an explicit, macabre pact. If you pull the trigger to kill me, the system guarantees you die with me. It's a chilling balance of absolute terror, where the only thing preventing the end of the world was the rock-solid guarantee of the end of the world.
And that grim theory was put to the ultimate test in October 1962. For 13 agonizing days, the entire world held its breath. U.S. spy planes had photographed Soviet nuclear launch pads under construction in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy's own generals were aggressively demanding airstrikes, a move that would have undoubtedly triggered World War III. Instead, he ordered a naval quarantine. Every single hour was an absolute masterclass in brinksmanship, ending only when both sides secretly traded missile withdrawals.
But beneath all the posturing of these monolithic superpowers, the sheer terror of those 13 days stripped these leaders right down to their raw humanity. In a rare, deeply vulnerable back-channel telegram, Khrushchev literally pleaded with Kennedy to untie that knot of war. It exposes the agonizing psychological burden they carried. These were giants of history, yes? But in that moment, they were just two terrified men desperately improvising to stop the clock on human extinction.
The sheer horror of staring into that abyss forced a tactical retreat. Washington and Moscow established a direct hotline to prevent deadly miscommunications and finally signed limited nuclear test bans. But, and this is absolutely vital to remember, the Cold War didn't actually end. The violence simply bypassed the Northern Hemisphere and relocated. The superpowers funded devastating proxy wars across Korea, Vietnam, and Latin America, where millions of lives were ground up in the gears of this relentless ideological machine.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really deeply uncomfortable question. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, officially ending the Cold War. But when we look around today at the mechanics of fear, the danger of miscommunication, and the massive arsenals of nuclear deterrence that are still on hair-trigger alert, have we actually dismantled the architecture of bipolarity, or did we just rebrand it for the 21st century? The history of the Cold War isn't just some story of the past. It's an urgent warning we are clearly still struggling to heed. Thanks so much for joining me.